Welcome to the podcast from Cold to Close. My name is Saeed and I'm the founder here at SRC Growth Partner, a company that works with professional service firms from around the world to help them increase their revenue and profitability by acquiring new clients. My guest today is Patrick Coggins. Patrick is the co-founder and co-CEO of CFO Domain, a fully remote finance consulting and search firm established in 2019. With over 20 years of experience in finance, human capital, and talent acquisition, Patrick has personally executed more than 200 searches and deployed over 300 consultants to private equity portfolio companies and Fortune 500 organizations across a diverse set of industries. Throughout his career, Patrick has gained valuable insights into the traits and strategies that drive high-performing finance teams. He regularly advises finance leaders on hiring, developing exceptional talent, and building strong organizational cultures. He's partnered with companies to help them navigate finance transformation, M&A, business process re-engineering, financial planning, controllership, and audit. Patrick's clients have included NBC Universal, Roku, Shamrock, Warner Brothers, Amgen, and eBay. So big clients there. He began his career in public accounting and holds a bachelor's in business administration accounting from the University of California in Santa Cruz. I've said a lot there, but Patrick, welcome.
Thank you, Saeed. It's great to be with you. And yeah, I mean, that's a long rap sheet, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's a lot there.
Yeah, no, 100% a lot there, and it was hopefully I've done it justice and I've managed to get through all the high ticket points. It really does show the caliber of guests that we've got on today. To all our viewers and listeners, the clients you've worked with, but also 2 decades working in the industry, you've obviously got some really valuable insights that you'll be able to share with us today. So I'm really looking forward to that. The best place I tend to start off with these podcasts and to really understand you in a bit more detail, and obviously I have gone into a little bit of detail on your background, but are you able to give a brief background on your own journey to where you are today and the current role you play within the business? And hopefully I haven't stolen your thunder.
No, not at all. Sure, I'd be happy to. So, I really fell into the business that I am in today. So, the quick origin story is this. So I actually wanted to play music professionally. I grew up as a percussionist. And when I was in university, I recognized at that time that the life of a musician, that there was uncertainty around whether or not I could have that career as a stable career to be able to make money, right? And kind of have a family, et cetera. So as a backup to that, as you had said, I got a degree in business, and inclusive of that is an education in accounting, right? Which by the way, I recommend for anybody who wants a large aperture around optionality in terms of what they want to go do post undergrad. So after school, all my friends were going to go work for the Big Four, right? They went to go work for PwC and Ernst & Young. And I actually passed up on that opportunity because I wanted to go do music. And so I ended up going to work for a much more smaller CPA firm that gave me the flexibility to play music. So if we fast forward, I ended up moving to Southern California and registering with a finance staffing agency, right? This was an industry that I did not know even existed at the time, right? These brokers that were taking talent in the marketplace and matching them with jobs. And so I went on an interview with one of their clients and they said, hold on. They said, you know what? You should come and sell for us. You should be an account executive. And it sparked my interest because I'd always had sort of an entrepreneurial streak, number one. Number two, I was not married to the idea of doing accounting. Accounting came really easy to me, debits and credits, right? And I said, okay, let me give this a try. And I'm glad that I did because I had a lot of success. And that was sort of the beginning of my career. And so to clarify what it is we do, the world of accounting and finance in corporate is actually much larger than most people understand if you don't work in finance, right? So it's not only making sure the books and records are complete and accurate and the company gets timely reporting, but it's making sure that public companies are SOX compliant. It's making sure that they're getting their sort of filings out, they're doing their SEC reporting. It's also FP&A, which is planning and budgeting and forecasting, right? Trying to provide directional guidance around where the business is going. It's things like treasury. It's things like getting your accounting systems all set up. It's things like data analytics. There's a whole world that touches the office of the CFO. 20 years, I was about 15 years into my career. I now worked at 2 firms. I started my own company in 2019 and with my co-founder, and we had a lot of lessons learned, as you might imagine, as an operator of our own company, right? Which I'd be happy to go into some of that. But it led me down a path of you have not taken leadership seriously. You now have your own company. Culture is really important. You don't have a great culture at your company presently. You need to do some things to remedy that. And so I did a real deep dive around that particular topic. I also noticed, by the way, that our clients were suffering from similar ailments and ended up coming up with a performance framework around how to build high performing teams, and have sort of channeled that framework in terms of how we run our current business and, share it with our clients as well. And so that's kind of, leads me to today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I love the quick whistle stop tour of your background. But I think where we are today is that high performance side of things, and the framework that you mentioned, the performance framework around developing high performance teams. And there's so many of the viewers and listeners out there that run their own businesses that I'm sure one of the biggest bottlenecks for any business at any stage is who you hire, right? And everyone, I'm sure, wants to hire the best possible people. So I guess my question to you would be, can you outline the key components of your performance framework for building a high performing team, and how do you ensure each element is effectively implemented?
Absolutely. So it's a triangle, and there are three sides to it. And then the three sides break down into kind of subcomponents, right? And as you had said, Saeed, I grew up in, really talent acquisition, right? Like going out and hunting the best talent we could find for our clients in the area of finance. And I think that what we believe fundamentally is that once you hire somebody, you enter into a social contract with that person, right? That's been built upon a set of expectations that hopefully were really effectively conveyed during the hiring process around what it's going to be like to work at your company, what it's going to be like to be able to grow and be successful. So, you want to make sure that, so that the first part of the triangle is what we call high impact hiring. Okay, that's number one, right? So you want to use an old adage, you got to make sure you've got the right people on the bus. So what does that mean? Well, there's a slew of tactical things you can do to make sure that you have a very robust and strategic hiring process that allows you to go out to find the right people in the marketplace, to be able to screen them effectively, and then to onboard them effectively, right? It's sort of all three things are really important. I can get into some of those tactics, if we want. The second part of the triangle is once you've hired the right people that are hopefully coachable, by the way, and hopefully resourceful, it's what we call principled leadership. So what that means is that leaders have to operate and lead from a place of principle, okay? So we say, be rigid in your principles, but be flexible and adaptable in your execution as a company, okay? So what does it mean to be principled? It means things like having a very clearly delineated purpose, right? What we call a just cause. Why is it compelling to work at your organization? Show me what you believe, so as an employee, I can make a decision to believe that thing as well, right? And join you on this journey. It also, there's a level of self-awareness around the company and the leaders to where it's, hey, this is what we believe in. These are the behaviors that we reward at our company. These are our systems. These are our processes. These are our methodologies. This is like what it's like to work here. And all these things are just really, really important, right? So they've got to lead principally. And then the third part of it is then they have to turn around, leverage those principles, and build trustworthy relationships with those employees, right? And that's what we call environmental trust. And so when you hire an employee, in many ways, what you're trying to do is get them up this trust curve as quickly as possible, because the higher they're on the trust curve, the more independence they have, the more responsibility they have, the less the less hands-on management that is required of them. And so that really frees up productivity upstream, right, for the organization. That's what we're trying to do with every employee. So we can move faster, we can iterate faster, we can innovate, we can take more risks, all those great things, right? And all these three sides of the framework, they all feed into each other, right? Because we know if you don't have leaders leading from principle, and if they're not building trustworthy relationships, then you're probably not retaining your talent, right? Your key talent. And if you're not retaining your key talent, then you're not leveraging that talent to attract other key talent to the company. Because when key talent is investigating whether or not they can want to go work at a company, what do? They start researching who else works there, right? Let me go look at who would be my colleagues here? Who would I report to? Like, what's the caliber of people working at this company? Mm-hmm. And so, you've got to hang on to your key people, and all these things kind of they just all benefit each other, right? So that's the framework. Oh, and I left out a very important piece. There's a central operating principle that ties it all together, okay? And it's based around radical candor, all right? And we've given it a name. It's called Sachoku. It's a Japanese name, which I can get into, but it basically means to be frank or to be candid, right? And there's a whole technique around what it takes to communicate the truth to an employee, giving them feedback and having a difficult conversation, right? And that sort of tethers everything together. You've got to have very honest and trustworthy relationships where you can communicate in a very candid way. So again, you can learn fast and you can get up that trust curve.
Yeah, I love that, and I love how all of the elements of the framework play into each other. And I think a few things ring to mind when you were running through those. And first is that element of the trust curve, right? And I always say internally, and I know many other people, I've spoken to many other entrepreneurs and business owners that say, trust but verify, right? So you want to trust your employee, but you verify. And it's really interesting you're saying that, because as you go up that trust curve, there's less requirement to verify because you trust them more and more. So that's really interesting. And also, 18 players love working with 18 players, don't they? So if you got a few 18 players on your team, it massively helps to bring in more 18 players in your team. So getting those first people in the door is the first step to being able to build that culture. And that leads me on to my next question. It's, how do you attract and hire potential 18 players? And what are some of the hiring strategies you could share with us? And that leans into your first framework, I believe.
Sure. Well, this all starts with knowing thyself as a company and as a leader, right? Because if you don't have a good sense of who you are and why people would want to come work with you and for you, and you can't articulate that in a compelling kind of value proposition, then, you're dead on arrival, so to speak, right? Because you can have the best talent acquisition strategies to go out and find the best people, but if you can't convince them, right, if you don't know who you are, etc., so it really begins there, okay? Number two, then it's, okay, let's go out and obviously try to find these folks, right? So what I do for a living is, we have a search firm, and we put a team of people on a particular client's need, and they're going to use a variety of different tools to go out and engage predominantly passive job seekers, okay? So, what a lot of companies do is they will post a job, and then they would just sit back and kind of wait for people to apply, and that'll be their applicant pool, right? And then they need to kind of screen and filter through that. The challenge with that is, most of those people that are applying are either in transition, unemployed, right? And perhaps they're unemployed for good reasons, but they could be unemployed for not good reasons, right? And it's sort of, you're not also getting a pool of people that are actually gainfully employed, that are effectively, statistically more likely to be in the quality bucket of what you're looking for, right? So if you're not willing to do that work yourself, if you don't have people internally within a company that are going to put together a list and go after and call people that are working at companies and try to sort of pitch them, then you should consider hiring a firm, obviously like us, right? Which has a specific expertise around a functional area and a network of people already that can go and try to find those folks, okay? The other thing that I think is important here, especially in the area of finance, is as you grow through your career, you're going to have war stories, you're going to, work with others, and you really need to nurture those relationships and keep in touch with those folks, because you'll find that over the years, you're going to want the ability to be able to pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, I just landed at this company, and we're going to go public, I think, in 2 years' time, and we could really use somebody like you. What do you think about putting the band back together and come joining us, right? And the problem is if you haven't actually nurtured that relationship for the last 3 to 4 years, that person might not be compelled to come join you, right? Or you might not have that. So I think taking a long-term orientation around your relationships and growing those, I think is really, really important. So in the screening part of what we do, there's so much to that, right? For one, I'll give you two quick tactics, right? Because we could spend the entire thing on this.
Yeah.
One, traditional job descriptions are not great. They're like a laundry list of responsibilities and sort of like a magical unicorn around, like this, they need to meet all these requirements, right? It's better to say, okay, let's make this an outcome-based scorecard. So what do I want this person to accomplish for me in the first 12 months? In our case, it might be implementing a system. It might be creating a new financial model. It might be streamlining the operations. So let's actually get to those 4 to 5 most important things they're going to do. And then when we talk to people, let's actually share those things. Like, hey, this is what I need to have done in the first 12 months. Have you done this before? Yes, I have. I know, great. Or how would you approach this, right? And I can use that as my interview rubric to essentially judge and assess their capabilities, right? And so it's like if you're going to hire somebody to come in and fix your garage door, right? Like I'm not going to say, I'm going to make this long list of responses. I'm going to say, these are my outcomes. I'm going to say, hey, I need someone to fix my garage door. How would you approach this? What would you do first? Walk me through your process. Oh, here's what I would do, and this would be my problem. Great. Can you show me where you've done this before? And can I reference that? Is that referenceable, right? So then when it's very relevant information, right? So we form the interview around the scorecard. And the last thing I'll tell you is we have this screening technique called TORC. It stands for Threat of Reference Check, okay? So we all know that in a traditional hiring process, we traditionally are not checking references until, the very end of the process. Well, what we do is we'll sit down with the candidate and we'll say, Saeed, who did you report to at this company? Right? And you say, oh, I reported to John, Great. Tell me about John. What was he like as a boss? And now you're thinking about your relationship with John. You're describing what his management style was. I'm putting you back in time, right? And I would say, great. So now, Saeed, tell me, what are some positive things that John would say about working with you? Like what would he testify to, right? About working. You say, yeah, he probably would say that I was well organized, that I really, I led the presentations effectively when we had to report out on X, Y, and Z. And I'm great. Now, when I talk to John, Saeed, because I do plan on talking to him at some point, right? When I talk to John, when I ask him, what are some opportunities that Saeed had, some areas where maybe he could have improved in, right? Where did you identify opportunities for him? What would he tell me? And now you're thinking in your mind, okay, he's going to talk to John. I got to tell the truth, right? And number two, I've already sort of, I've already kind of like cultivated this sort of putting you back in time relating to the relationship. Now you're likely to be very honest with me. You'll say, well, he'll probably say that I could have been a little bit better around this thing over here and maybe this thing over there and kind of this thing over here, right? And by the way, that's fine because we'll tell the candidate we're not looking for perfection, right? In fact, the whole idea behind having a growth mindset and not a fixed mindset is that you acknowledge that the only way to get better and to grow is to cast some light on your deficiencies, right? So that tends to work really well. And so what we're trying to do is gain a quick assessment up front. Is this hire a statistically likely potential, like a potential A player for the company? And if so, let's put them through the rest of the interview process. But if not, let's maybe move them to the side, put them on hold, right? And we're trying to accelerate that information as quickly as we can kind of upfront in the process.
Sure. There's a lot to unpack there, but it's a really interesting it's a really interesting thought because there's a lot more than just finding the right candidate and then bringing them into the right person. There's a lot more thought behind trying to find the right type of person for the right type of organization, and that talk technique really does strike me as quite interesting, just because you are pacing them in the way that you want them to think, right? And so that, and putting them in the shoes of someone else, but also with their own lens. So it's giving them the opportunity to understand from their background. So in terms of then the types of metrics and I guess what metrics or indicators do you use to measure the performance of your team, or what do you recommend an organization would do to measure the performance of their team, and how would you adjust strategies based on these metrics?
Well, I think, obviously every team company is different, right? And, so I could give some kind of best practice sort of guidelines around some of this stuff. Number one is if you should have the capability operationally to measure a lot within your company, right? And so what that means is, obviously you don't want to rely on a human being having to update a spreadsheet to be able to tell you how many meetings they had or how many, right? You want to try to avoid that as much as you can, right? Because there's no internal control with that. So the more that you can systematize, the better, okay? Number two, even though you should be able to measure a lot of these things, you don't want to boil the ocean around metrics, okay? You want to really come together and say, okay, what are the top 5, top 6, maybe top 7 key performance indicators, right? The most important things that are really actionable, right? If I had access to this data, it would help to inform a decision or a change in behavior that I need to make as a leader or my employee needs to make. And so once you figure out what those top KPIs are, then you want to maniacally drill into those, right? And you want to take them very seriously. And you might put them on a scorecard. You might look at them. What we do is, we have a stand up, kind of every Monday morning where we get the whole company rallied together, and we'll have a combination of obviously personal catch up. It's not obvious, but personal catch up discussions paired with looking at how we did last week, right? And so if those metrics are important, you need to get them visually in front of people, and you need to publish them often, right? At least once a week so everybody can kind of see them, And so in terms of like what the right metrics are, I mean, again, it depends, right? I mean, it could be, if I just put my finance lens on, it could be revenue growth, margin growth, the amount of customers we've acquired in a certain period, the amount of turnover or retention we've had with the customers. It could be our customer acquisition costs. Like all these things are important. They matter. If you're working in a sales capacity, I mean, the obvious ones are, deals in the pipeline, deals getting closed, leads that were developed this week. And then, maybe if you want to look at activity, how many calls did the salesperson make? How many meetings did they execute? Were they executing with the right kinds of decision makers, right? Was it a good use of their time? And making sure that all that stuff is getting into the system as it should be getting in, right? So you're pulling the data from the system to help provide a layer of accountability that, the salesperson is doing the work, but they're also inputting the work into the system, So I mean, that's generally what I would say around metrics and
Yeah, I think that's always really interesting because it is very dependent on the role, the department. But if you have overarching KPIs to work towards, it's very key to be able to operate in a way that is clearly structured for the benefit of the team member as well as the organization, right? In terms of then leadership and going back to the framework that you have. What kind of leadership style do you have, and how does it contribute to creating a productive and motivated team environment?
Yeah, so great question. So it's interesting. So when you think about traditional notions of leadership, you tend to think of, people who are very visionary, very vocal, very charismatic in that way. They have a presence, right? And those are attributes that I think are very, I think, important and I think are great to have. But it turns out they're not the most important attributes. I think some of the most important attributes of true leadership today is really two things, right? It's authenticity, and do you genuinely care about your employees? Because if you have those two things, then you will work really, really hard, right, around what we think about kind of servant leadership, to really serve your employees, to give them the resources they need to be effective, right, to kind of unblock the path ahead of them so that they can be successful for you in the company. And and ultimately, if you're being authentic, you're modeling behavior that you really want from them. So what I mean by that is if you give your employee a deliverable or a request and they don't actually know how to get that thing done, right? And once you've given them a request or a deliverable, you might say, look, I expect this to be on my desk by the end of the week, right? Or you got 3 weeks or whatever the case is. If you don't have psychological safety in the environment, you sort of go back to the framework and building environmental trust, right? If you don't have that and the employee, excuse me, doesn't feel comfortable in raising their hand and saying, I actually don't know how to do that thing, or I'm missing a resource, or I have a couple of questions, then that leads to that's not very productive, right? They could sit on their hands. They could go on a fishing expedition asking other people instead of coming to you. Other people will give them maybe not only the wrong answer, no answer, or the wrong answer potentially. They could be led down a different pathway, right? So leadership is making it so that the employee feels like they can really come to you, have a genuine relationship, and work with you cohesively to be able to get that thing done, right? That's really important. The other part is you want to be somebody that inspires your employees and knows what motivates your employees, because when you're having conversations with them about, hey, look, here's what we need to do. These are the goals we need to meet. Or you're having difficult conversations around feedback, here, this thing didn't get done. Can you help me understand why? And, was it not made clear? And, what are your thoughts around it? I really think that having the ability to kind of have those kind of genuine conversations all comes back to having a personal relationship with that employee where you're building trust, right? So these things are all important. So you asked me what my leadership style is. I mean, all these things I care about, right? And I try to do, I'm a work in process, right? I came up with the framework. It's not like I've mastered it just because I came up with this framework. I'm actually always referring back to it as a kind of a benchmark, saying, hey, how well am I doing in these various kind of vectors, right? And, I would say that I do care very personally about our employees, and I want to see them be successful. And you have to be able to also walk right into very uncomfortable conversations and have that. And you have to explain to employees up front, look, these are kind of the rules of the game, so to speak, right? We're trying to be better. And part of that is, I'm going to have to be very truthful around feedback and very transparent. And by the way, I want to invite you to share feedback with me as well. I need to make sure that I'm self-aware. And if there's something that I could do better or differently to help sort of improve, your ability to be successful, I'm going to give you the opportunity to communicate those things to me, right? Without any kind of retribution, right? And that's what, that's really what true leadership is about.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree with you more. And I can speak from my own experience. I think one of the toughest things I find is when you talk internally with a team member and you want to give them feedback. Obviously, you have a specific requirement that you want an outcome that needs to be served, but you also need to be able to deliver that in a way where that team member doesn't turn away from you and go, oh, what a horrible boss, or anything like that. And you want to be able to, it's an interesting one because it's naturally about connection, right? Having a good connection with the team member. But at the same time, that feedback element, some people can take it personally. And so it can be a challenge in that sense. It's like, okay, well, we want to be in an environment where we can grow and get better, but then it becomes a challenge of how you navigate that. I think it's really interesting you mentioned that. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I share some things with you on that topic?
Yeah,
Okay.
Cool.
So you brought up a lot of interesting points, right? This delicate dance is a lot of what our central operating principle aims to address. Okay. So, again, it's called Sachoku, and it's a Japanese word that stands for, to be straightforward and honest in speech and behavior, right? But, in the Japanese culture, preserving harmony in the relationship, as you had put it, right? So thinking about how you try to make that a two-way conversation where you continue to maintain the engagement of the employee, by the way, it's not an easy thing to do. Now, there are a lot of inputs into that dialogue that come before you sit down to that conversation that do play a factor into how well you are received, right, when you're giving feedback. But focusing on the technique for a moment, what we find to be helpful is to try to treat it like an exploration or an inquiry into something. And also don't assume that you have all the answers as a boss, because many times I've had, I thought I had an understanding around something. And once I've got more data, more information, I altered my opinion a little bit, right? So I think the way to approach that in many ways is, hey, John, can I explore something with you? Or can we explore something together? So you're just trying to enroll them into the conversation, right? And make it a two-way thing. And you say, hey, I noticed this thing, right? Or I got the chance to review this work that you did for me. And, I noticed that it seemed to be missing this thing and that thing. It was ambiguous to me. I couldn't follow the narrative, whatever the case was. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts? Did you in any way feel that way as well, right? And so again, you're asking the person questions instead of just thinking about like, okay, I just need to deliver my judgment and hope they take it well, right? And instead, we're trying to make it this kind of two-way conversation. So that's really sort of the difference around kind of what we try to do. If feedback is not normalized in your environment, then it's hard. Obviously, the ego is wrapped up in the work that we do, right? And so you have to make sure you're challenging the behavior, not necessarily the person, right? So you don't judge the person, you judge the behavior. The person was just the instrument in the behavior, right? So the word choice is important. The tone is important. All these things play a role, So anyhow, and by the way, even if you get it wrong, okay, if you come at it from the perspective of like demonstrating a level of humility up front, like for example, if you say, hey, John, I need to have a really awkward conversation with you. And by the way, I might get it wrong. And if I get it wrong or I'm missing something here, I'm hoping you'll let me know, right? So we can fix it. But, I could really use your help here with this conversation, okay? And so it's like now I've got maybe John rooting for me a little bit, right? And there's a little bit of empathy going back and forth. And then I can move on to kind of address the substance. Hey, I noticed this thing didn't get done, right? Or whatever the case was. Can you help me understand what happened, right? Or why, And again, it's an inquiry, right? An exploration. So
I love that. And definitely tactics that I need to implement more. And I try to always approach those conversations as two-way as possible. But and I what you said there in the sense that judge the behavior, not the person. And I love that. And I'm gonna go. If I leave this podcast with anything, it's that, because that's exactly it. It's the person is the instrument. So I think that's a really interesting takeaway there. In terms of strategies to build trust, and what are the strategies? What should someone do, a leader do in the organization to build the trust in a high performing team, especially if you're in a remote work environment, which a lot of organizations are becoming more comfortable with. So what are the strategies around that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So there's lots of things that you can do. There's building trust is, in some ways, it's not as difficult as people think. Okay. So for example, if I catch you in the act of doing good things, okay, and I point that out to you, that builds trust, right? You get a dose of oxytocin, we're bonding over that. And if that happens repeatedly over time, then your default reaction will begin to be, hey, I just trust Patrick, right? When he comes to me with something, like I just trust what he's saying, okay? So I think part of the issue with feedback is that when you hear that word, as a leader, right, who wants things to be better, you're thinking of like, what's the corrective behavior? What can the employee be doing differently? Alternatively, you should really be trying to, more often than not, provide, like, you should what we call confirmatory praise, right? So like, they're doing something that you showed them how to do, or something they should be doing, and you point it out and say, hey, by the way, you handled that call really well. I love how you had that objection ready to go with that client when they expressed that concern around, right, X, Y, or Z. Fantastic job. And just by pointing that out, you now trust me more, okay? Because you know that I'm dialed in and I care and I'm listening in to sort of what you're doing, okay? So that's number one. Number two, you really need to do as you say and say what you do, right? So you need to be reliable and consistent as a leader. I got to keep my promises. I got to keep my commitments to you. And that happens at a small level and a big level, right? Small level meaning, hey, Saeed, we're going to have a one-on-one every Friday at 9:30 a.m. And if I cancel those like 2 in a row, right? I got overloaded and I've got these other things. I'm sorry, let's just push. Then that is chipping away at trust, right? You might forgive me for 1 week, but if I'm doing that consistently, I'm not building trust with you. So if I keep my meetings with you, right? Or if I'm late to a meeting and I have not communicated that to you, hey, I'm running 5 minutes late, you didn't hear anything from me and I just show up, all these little things build trust, right? If I said, hey, Saeed, I know you want us to invest in your certification for this thing, and we're going to get that done in the month of March, but then we weren't able to accomplish that for whatever reason. We had budgetary constraints. I need to be able to come to you and say, Saeed, I know we said this and I'm accountable to that. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get it done as I had hoped because we ran into these other sort of cost measures, but we're going to put it first thing on the agenda come April. Now, yeah, I've explained it, I've remedied it, etc. If the month of March comes and goes and I have not addressed it, I'm not building trust, right? Sure. If I'm in a meeting and we're brainstorming, okay, and I have an opinion about whatever the topic might be, I don't want to bias the room. I want you to say something and Jill to say something and Susan to say something and Sam to say something before I even let the room know what my perspective is. And I want to hear from everybody. And if I see that somebody has something to say, I'm gonna ask them. I'm gonna probe them and say, "Hey, Jill, looks like you have something to say. Please feel free to say," right? And so I don't want to curtail anybody's other opinion. So, and the other thing is making it like safe for people to communicate dissenting opinions. Okay, so if we're in a public meeting, okay, and somebody is like, I don't think that's a good idea because of X, Y, Z. And maybe they didn't deliver it in the right way. They chose the wrong venue, whatever the case is, right? But the fact that they were honest, you should stop for a moment, just say, you know what? Number one, I just want to say, thanks for having the courage to be honest, right? Thanks for having the courage to communicate an opinion that you probably know is not my opinion, right? And if other employees are listening in, they're hearing this and they're going, okay, this is building psychological safety in the environment. Right? This is great. Okay, I can express my opinion fairly. Even if we don't say yes to that thing and we don't move in that direction, the fact that I can still express my opinion builds a ton of trust, right? And then I move to address the substance. Say, John, right now is not the right forum to probably talk about that, but let's have a conversation offline. We could talk more about that. But thank you for being honest, right? And so, again, there's a lot of tactical things you can do, but all those things build trust.
Yeah, no, I love that, and some really actionable takeaways there for our listeners and viewers there in being able to walk away and actually have some active methodologies to be able to. I love what you said there. If you're in a room and someone actively dissents, and to be open to go, you probably know that that's not my opinion, but I love that you said that because that I'm not right all the time. I could be wrong, right? And if you think you're right all the time, you're most likely wrong 50% of the time, right? So that
yeah, and hopefully you've hired very smart people,
exactly,
right? And you value their opinions, right? And you want to be able to come to the table and be able to say, look, at the end of the day, as an owner of a company, for many owners anyways, I won't speak for everybody, the kind of utopia is to have your employees come up with the ideas, right? Let your employee tell you what they think is best. In many cases that might be best, right? It might be the best thing. I'm going to totally, I don't have the exact quote, but Steve Jobs was kind of famous for this, where, he would do an interview and the candidate would say something like, well, what's your plan for how you, plan to kind of grow this team and roll this product out? And he would say, well, if I had the answer for that, I wouldn't have a need to hire you, would I? Right? So, I mean, it's an excellent point, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just because you're a leader doesn't mean you're the person who needs to have all the answers. You are more of a facilitator, right? And somebody to provide guidance and a framework and a pathway around these things, less so of the person who needs to have, again, the answers to every question.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of I'd be butchering it if I tried to quote it, but Stephen Bartlett says, as one of the most important thing, he visualizes every business owner as a massive recruitment firm. The business owner is the recruitment firm and he is recruiting the best employees possible for the organization, right? Yep. And so every single business is always in the business of recruiting top talent. And that's your job as a business owner is to absolve yourself of all the day-to-day runnings and let your team be able to handle the day-to-day. So I think that's really interesting. So this section of the podcast we call the Entrepreneur's Room. And these are a series of questions we ask all of our guests, and they are designed to really give our viewers and listeners an opportunity to understand the way a business owner thinks. And the first question we typically ask here is, how are you currently spending your days as a leader of the business?
My goodness, by doing too many different things all at once. So it's interesting. First of all, I'm on this podcast, right? And one of the things, and the reason why is because, certainly, I think building brand is really important, right? Not only in the personal level, but obviously for the company level, right? So you want to be able to get to a place where you're leveraging assets, media assets to do some work on your behalf where you can actually leverage attention, right? I think that's really important because you're out in the world to induce change, to advance some kind of cause, and you want people to notice, you want to attract people to your organizations to help you do that, right? I'm spending, we're a relatively lean, organization. A lot of my focus is on generating demand. So, I've got, 6 back-to-back meetings, later today that are all kind of 30 minutes each, right? Where I'll be speaking with CFOs, heads of finance and accounting, and just sort of understanding where we have opportunities to support them, right? And doing kind of catch-ups around their own particular businesses. So I'll do a chunk like that usually after lunch, 5 or 6 meetings back to back. Pretty tired by the end of the day after that, as you might imagine. And I think, in the mornings, it's sort of our check-ins and our stand-ups with the team. How are we doing? How are we gauging? Let's make sure we set the right priorities for the day. We know what everybody's doing, et cetera. And then there's all kinds, as an owner, there's all kinds of things that, like today, I was on a call with our retirement administrator around at a company level to make sure that we were on top of sending, statements out to people who had vested into this schedule for, our retirement plans, right? So there's a ton of we have taxes coming up, for example, right? We've got contributions that need to be made. There's all kinds of stuff as a business owner that is unrelated to the actual meat of the operations, kind of selling and recruiting. And I think again, if you haven't made the decision yet to go into business for yourself, just make sure you pick something that you're going to be really excited about, okay? Because there's a lot of other work. If this is your first time operating a company, there's a lot of other work that you are not anticipating. We do business in a ton of different states, for example, and maintaining organization around all the tax related reporting around all that is, we have someone that does it for us, but nonetheless, there's still a lot of Q&A that comes to us, right? And every state has their own kind of regulatory, if we hire an employee in that state, do they need a disability policy? There's all kinds of things that we have to take into consideration. Do we meet the right thresholds for having to report into that state from an income perspective, a revenue perspective? All these things matter. Hopefully that's.
I think that's a great picture for all those that are listening of how busy it can get for any business owner trying to juggle more than just the day-to-day operations, right? So my next question would be, and I know you touched on it earlier, but it's more around metrics. What are the most important metrics for you and your own business as a leader of the business?
Yeah. For us, it's really simple. We're trying to generate demand. We're a services firm, and our buyers are traditionally CFOs, right? So I want to make sure I have a metric around how many meetings did I have this week, not only for myself, but also for our salespeople. How many meetings did they have with CFOs or, VPs of finance, folks in leadership positions within companies? How many actually got executed, right? How many leads were developed from those meetings? And so that's a really important metric for us, right? For our recruiters, it would be looking at things like how many candidates did they source in a given week? How many opportunities are they actively engaged on that they're actually working on? How many people did they interview on a weekly basis? That's really important. How many of those people they interviewed actually moved to the next step? How many are scheduled on my calendar? I have a BDR person that helps to schedule meetings for me. So how many meetings did they set for me? And how many calls did they have to make to be able to book those amount of meetings, right? What's the ratio between calls and meetings? So those are the activity metrics that we look at because those drive results. And of course, the financials are pretty easy. It's top line revenue, consulting revenue, cost of goods sold. It's kind of all the normal stuff.
It's really interesting to hear. And in terms of then growing your business, what are the activities you're doing to grow your business? How are you currently growing your business? What business development activities are you doing? And it sounds like you mentioned that earlier on the phones, but what other activities are you doing to grow the organization? And obviously you mentioned that you're looking at drumming up demand and things like that.
Yeah, so we think a lot about technology in many ways. So, one of the exciting things about starting our own business was the opportunity to kind of start over with a blank sheet of paper around what the tech stack would look like for us. A lot of our companies that we had worked at previously, they had been around for quite some time. So they had a lot of kind of technical debt and various systems, right, that they were working, et cetera. So I think for us, we are right now piloting a kind of multi-channel email automation tool that would give us the ability to be much more efficient with, kind of communication out to the marketplace with our clients. And to be clear, I mean, we've used a variety of different types of these tools in the last kind of 18 months, but we've had mixed results with these tools. Everything from UX, UI, functional ease to whether they play well in terms of having multiple email addresses on somebody versus, the robust integration we get to our CRM environment. All these things matter. And, they all do it, differently, right? So we found a tool that we think we really like, but we're still in the testing phases of it. And if this works out well in our favor, I think it'll help to augment, because in a services-based company, if you think about it, I mean, unlike a SaaS company or a tech company that really scales, right? Kind of as you write code and people sign up, you only get what you put in, right? Like you've got to go out and get your clients, And so if we are, if we're leveraging technology and communication and content, I think content's the other thing that's really important. Making sure that we've got great content so we're established as an authority on our, range of topics. And that's going out because we never quite know when a client's going to have a need, right? Like their head of finance leaves them, the company's getting acquired, they have to implement a new system and they go, God, I really could use some help. Where's Patrick's phone number? Where's his email address? And so making sure we've got the right amount of touches and we've kind of made that very programmatic. That's really what we're focused on right now, what we're trying to do.
Yeah, we always tell our partners keeping top of mind is one of the most important things you can do in your business. By being top of mind, you ensure that people actually think of you when they need you. Last question, Patrick, and this is what we like to end every podcast with. It's if you had a magic wand you could wave to solve one business problem, what would that be?
Oh my gosh. Honestly, we're 100% remote. We get together one time one time a year. We try to make it twice a year, but if I had a way to wave of wand to get all my employees, because they're all in different states, right? If I could take all of my employees, put them in one location during the business day, and then have them magically transport back to, right, home, I would love that, right? Because I just think that would be so, I mean, don't get me wrong, working remotely has its very clear advantages. For one, we don't have overhead, we don't have rental overhead, right? That's wonderful. But we do miss out on some of those cultural pieces that I think are really important when you're kind of building bonds, right? And I think having the opportunity to work co-located would be what I would fix.
Wonderful. Well, Patrick, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you, and thank you for sharing all your insights today. Some really actionable things to be able to take away from today, so really appreciate that. But yeah, pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you, Saeed. It's a pleasure. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.